Hi, Danny.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good, chilling. I just had a coffee. I had half of a coffee. Um, yeah, like those beans are quite strong. So welcome to the Hoppin' platform. Um, we're chilling right now. People are going to be coming in. We'll kick it off at 4. We see kind of like on the upper right side. There's like the chat. So I want to just put. Actually, you know what I want to put in the chat? I want to put in the code of conduct because we're going to get room with conversation. Um, yeah. Okay, that's cool. Um, I think I will go. I'll kind of walk through that, introduce uh, who am I existing, who are you existing, and then kick it off. But I think I could provide also the social identity worksheet whenever whenever you feel like it's appropriate. I could just like pop it in the chat.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, you can go ahead and we can have that just in there now.
Okay, sure. I don't know if when people come in, that link is already there. But I'm gonna put it in.
So in order to share my slides,
There's a little button there's a little monitor button. I don't know if
mhm.
you want to try it.
Here, I'll help you get set up really quick. Sorry.
Maggie!
I was like watching you and I was like, I feel like I should provide assistance.
Sure.
Yeah, so like there's like that screen with like a line through it. Are you sharing PowerPoint slides? So what you want to do first?
Well, Google Slides, but yeah.
Okay. So I think you want to put them. How do you view them? I think you want to put them. Let me see what the actual command is in Google Slides. I think it's like a reader view or something. Like on the top, like if there's like a different way to like view your slides like separately. So I think, let me see. View.
There's a grid view.
So there's a.
For the Google Slides?
Yeah. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. My bad.
Isn't there there's a presenter? Yeah, there's just like the present button.
Yeah, so if you present, it like might take away your whole screen. So at that point, what you're just gonna want to do is just like make it smaller so that you can see both, and then you can share that window after the fact.
Okay.
Amazing. Thank you, Maggie.
No problem. I'm gonna dip and like let you guys do your thing, but I'm here if you need anything.
Always. Okay. It is 4. You let me know when you're ready. Okay. Because I feel like when I click that button, I'm going to get lost. But I shouldn't be clicking the button because I'm not. But I hope everyone's, Women in STEM Breaking Barriers Day 1 has been going amazing. We had so many amazing conversations happen. Tea time was a party. Andrea Ghez slayed it as the queen she is. We had some awesome panels so far. It's been really exciting to have all of you a part of the conference. Very grateful for everyone's attendance and opportunity to just share your experiences and listen in on others and learn, and if not, just stare at the screen mindlessly. Man, that's all right too. We welcome everything and everyone. Amazing. Okay, so before we get started, I just want to say hello and welcome to the Women in STEM Breaking Barriers not only conference but the intersectionality session. I want to start off by just saying some guidelines to follow at all times. Exercise consideration. This is such an important session, personally. So I just want to say exercise consideration, respect in your speech and actions. Alert conference staff if you notice a dangerous situation, someone in distress, or violations in our code of conduct. Thank you for coming. With that said, my name is Elia. I'm on the organizing committee for Women in STEM Breaking Barriers, second year PhD student in computer science, they, she pronouns. Today I have the pleasure of introducing not only a lovely friend, but a baddie, literally. So like Danny is a special human being in my life. And literally, what's it called? So Daniel, who uses he, they pronouns, is a queer and trans social worker working for Sacramento City Unified School District and overseeing the LGBTQ plus support services program. It's an honor to have you, Danny, and I'm so down to just listen in and learn about intersectionality. So floor is yours, my friend. I'm gonna turn off my vid.
Great. Well, thank you so much for introducing me. Like I said, my pronouns are he and they. My name's Daniel Buffington. And today I was going to be talking to all of you and hopefully opening up a discussion about intersectionality and what that means and how we apply that to our lived experiences in our lives as we work in all of these different fields. So we'll just start right off. So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it was coined in her 1989 paper that spoke to demarginalizing the intersection of race and sex. And the purpose of this was to, sort of put, place language to the unique experience that she herself and her own identity as being a Black woman in these different sort of feminist movements and anti-racist movements, and where Black women specifically are placed in the sidelines and left out, perhaps taken a back seat and or placed in like the back burner in terms of, these individual movements, in terms of feminist movements specifically. We see a lot of white feminism. There's a lot of conversation around, like for example, when did all women gain the right to vote, for example? So looking at what happens when we leave out these core pieces of a person's identity and sort of implications of those things. And intersectionality at large is a way for us to talk about both the ways that we experience privilege and, the ways that we do not, and how those unique pieces of our identity and those individual sort of pieces come together to make up who we are as individuals, and it influences, the way we perceive the world, the way we take in new information, as well as the way that others treat us and the way that, certain opportunities are afforded to us or not. So for example, for myself, I am a queer person, I'm a trans person, I'm a Latinx person, but I experience a lot of white assumed privilege. And the longer that I am in, my social sort of transition as being a trans person, the more I'm afforded cis assumed privilege, being a cisgender person, by folks that I interact with in the world, and the way that changes, my own personal position in our larger culture. And so what we're going to be diving into is looking at who we are and how that impacts us and how we communicate with others. And so there is a link in the comment section that will take you to a social identity worksheet. It's a little bit different than what the slide here looks like. So you're welcome to use both of them as a reference. And I think it would be nice for us to both use the chat to engage in a conversation, or folks are comfortable in sharing their screens or audio, you are definitely welcome to. And I'd love to have a chat back and forth. So the way that this intersectionality wheel works as we see that our sort of core pieces of our identity are here in the center. So, things that are generally considered to be a little more fixed, though we know things like gender and sexual orientation and physical ability or qualities, like those types of pieces of our identity can change over a period of time, can change throughout a lifetime, though they are personal to us. And then the sort of outer part of the circle are the other pieces of our identity that either gain us access or serve to gatekeep us out of those particular statuses. So things like parental status, geographic location, thinking styles, things like that, and how those come into play. So I think for the sort of first discussion piece, I'd like folks to take a moment and maybe consider, if I could only choose 3 of these identity categories, what would those 3 be, and why might that be the case?
When we pick the identity categories, like let's say we just throw 3 in the chat. Should we pick from the outside circle or the inside?
That is a good question. You can pick from any part of the circle. I'm thinking just any 3 pieces that are really core to who you are.
Yeah, folks, so please feel free to throw 3 that relate to you most personally.
Let's see, Emma, with physical abilities, race, sexual orientation. Thank you, Emma. You did do it correctly, yes. So folks are welcome. You're welcome to either choose like the identity category or your identity specifically, if that's something you feel comfortable sharing. And I kind of want to think about what about those 3 really like drew you to those? Was it an easy decision to just pick those sort of 3 pieces? No, definitely not. Yeah. Because we're we're multifaceted people, right? So, we all have these pieces of our identity to think about and consider and everything, and which ones really come to the forefront of our mind when we are first thinking, how would I introduce myself to the world, and how does the world see me? So for some folks, would you say that the 3 that you chose, is that due to that is how you perceive yourself, or is that the way that you feel you are perceived by others? Potentially both.
I gotta throw the monkey wrenches in here. I gotta throw the monkey wrench. Also, everyone, feel free to throw in your audio too. Like, it doesn't have to be one way.
Yeah, definitely folks are welcome to, just share their audio if they'd like.
You're reading the comments. I think sex and ethnicity are easy because I think about them all the time, but then I thought about job classification, and as a teacher, I get kind of this, wow, God bless you, look, so that one specifically is how I'm perceived. We got another one saying from Hannah, education, sex, geographic location, more of how I perceive myself.
Didn't want to go there yet. Whoops. And I'm wondering for folks how much this perhaps is, if any, has shifted during the course of, the pandemic and being in lockdown and perhaps not interacting with folks as much. And if that has sort of shifted the way we view ourselves, like who are we when we're sitting alone with ourselves, and what does that do to the way that we view the world in general? see Emma's comment. Can't really change these things. There's fluidity in sexuality, but race and physical abilities can't be changed. Maybe privilege may help. The stigmas, assumptions associated with physical appearance. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's an interesting, point. Like, yeah, there is fluidity in some of these categories. Physical ability, that is something that can change over a lifetime, right? And that definitely can vary. And I think some folks, unless your identity, does have that kind of shift, it may not be something that you necessarily consider as being core to who you are, until that shift has happened, and you see the sort of stark differences. And I see Maggie. Yes, I think I definitely agree. So, the way that we, if we were in person, and this was like a perfect world in which all citizens were cared for with healthcare and things like that, we would be talking about these sort of individual pieces of our identity, right? These 3 identity categories, and then thinking about what would happen if somebody crossed off, one of those identities. What if somebody, had the ability to take one of those away, and why? And it's something that we often do when we overlook, without realizing we do to folks all the time, when we assume pronouns, for example, when we assume relationship status or sexuality of, does your partner, not using neutral language like partner, for example, but, assuming certain identities of folks, for example, can certainly, for the person that may be misgendered, not seem like a big deal, may not seem like that's, equivalent to just full erasure of a person's identity. But what we know is that, that does trigger a trauma response, right? And this idea that who we are is not being seen or respected, for example, something that's core to our personality and to our personhood and our identity, being disregarded in that way, certainly impacts mental health. It impacts our trauma responses and our ability to take in new information, our physical health and things like that. And so, it's no small thing to really think about and be able to list, these sort of which 3 pieces of your identity, are front and center to you, because those ultimately inform the way that you move forward in these different spaces, right? And particularly, for a conference that is Women in STEM, thinking about what that means for each individual participant and even being in this field, let alone like all of the other social pressures outside of your, education and outside of your like field of study, right? And something that is important to think about is, these systems that we are all a part of. And so, you often hear messages like, we need to fix the way that the system is. We need to, just like repair what has been broken. But ultimately, the system in which we're operating, where there are the haves and the have-nots, that is a system that is running and operating like a well-oiled machine, right? It is something that was created to be this way. The social constructs that we have around, gender, around sexuality, around race, all of those things are there for a reason, right? And so, as quoted by W.E.B. Du Bois, a system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect. And so, when we're thinking about applying this to like a real world sort of thought and into our like real lives, you know, considering this sort of mindset of like, right, this is operating the way that it should. We see these injustices happening, and you know, there's sort of a knee-jerk reaction to be like, but how could it happen? How could it be here? You know, it's 2021, things like that. Who thought that these types of things were still happening? But the reality is that they continue to, because that is what we are built upon. Until we recognize the sort of importance to create something new, and have more of like a community focus and the needs of, you know, all folks rather than the individualism that we're brought up under, you know, the cycle just continues. And kind of go to, I'm wondering if anybody has any, you know, sort of thoughts on their identity, if we'd like to talk about that a little further, these identity categories, and what about the ones that you chose, you know, really drew themselves out? Did they just kind of jump off the page to you in terms of, this is who I am and I know it? Or is this perhaps sort of the first time that you've sat down and really like thought about that in a particular way?
Sorry, that was my cat. I'm going to just jump in here. Everyone else is welcome to jump in any way they'd like, but I definitely, the ones that you presented definitely jumped out at me: thinking styles, education, sexual orientation. I mean, on my IG, my bio is like confusing hetero cis men since 1995. Like, I definitely take pride in just like perturbations, if you will, societal perturbations. Yeah, so that jumps out, but then thinking about removing something hurts, you know? Like, I think, I don't know, maybe I'd remove, I would remove like education. No. So many essays for scholarships written about seeking education. No, thinking style is definitely the one I wouldn't remove. That's the number one thing. Yeah, I don't know. I can't really choose, but definitely take pride in having an education and just, you know, perturbing heteronormativity, cis heteronormativity. So it's fun. Anyone else?
So thinking about this talk, hello everyone. I think about like being, sorry, can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
I feel like thinking about being Asian and like an Asian woman at this current climate and the kind of things that are happening and the kind of violence against Asians that we've all heard about. It just, I think about my privilege and like the idea that my parents picked an area to live in that is mostly Asian and how protected and safe I feel here. And I was walking around Highland Park earlier and I'm like, is it even safe for me to be in this area? Because I'm not protected by people who look like me and I'm not a majority anymore. So it's just, it's so weird to see this and like to think about like, wow, I've been under like the protection and this umbrella of living in like, you think about San Gabriel Valley and 626, like people will first say like it is so awful driving here because it's so like so many, and it's like a terrible stereotype. And I don't agree with it because I'm an excellent driver, but I love living here. I love the idea that I can walk my dog and I'm not, I know my neighbors and I can get by speaking like Spanish and Tagalog and like very, very little Cantonese, you know? So that's something that like I am deeply grateful for and that is part of my like so important in my identity. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think you raised like a good point too in terms of where we feel safe and what those spaces look like and what is portrayed by like popular media, for example, as being like a safe neighborhood or safe areas. Like, where does a lot of you know, a lot of like funding go in particular areas, right? But you know, being a person with marginalized identities, like that definitely shifts, that changes, for sure. Like I know for myself after being in the, you know, in lockdown for like the past year, and for example, buying new clothes, ordering online is a pretty comfortable experience, right? But I, you know, recently bought something in person, and as a, you know, a trans masculine person shopping in like a men's section, for example, those are the clothes I'm going to purchase. That's like, those are the style of clothes that I like to wear. But getting help from like a sales associate for men's fashion, for example, doesn't necessarily feel safe, because there are the automatic sort of assumptions of how things should fit particular bodies, you know, anatomy of particular folks, like measuring, you know, where your Adam's apple is, and it's like, right, okay, yeah, sure. So like all of those sort of things that we kind of like take, we don't necessarily like think about either, and so there's that sort of like shock factor, and that sort of like culture shock essentially of the, you know, those that do experience those privileges, and getting a glimpse into how that varies for myself as an individual. And so I want to talk about this idea of these, you know, systemic isms and phobias and things like that. So, you know, if we're looking at an example of systemic sexism and transphobia, for example, we can see in like the medical field with gender affirming services, to, you know, routine checkups. So the idea that even in these spaces where we don't necessarily think, you know, about how inclusive it is, for example, for my hospital that I go to, there is a women's health section, and, you know, women's like reproductive care and things like that. And I'm still a person that will have to access those services looking the way that I do. And so that, you know, immediately puts me into a particular, you know, position of vulnerability, with all of the folks that I'm sharing like a waiting room position in, you know, physician that I'm working with, right? So, you know, we don't necessarily think as we're passing like a women's health section in a hospital, like, oh, this could be like more inclusive. This should be, you know, improved upon necessarily, unless we're sort of looking at it in that intersectional approach of lots of different bodies are needing to access this space. And like our understanding and our constructs around, you know, sex and gender, for example, aren't fixed, and things like that need to change and evolve as well to better serve the larger population. We can see examples of systemic racism in terms of people of color, particularly Black women, being denied care, symptoms being dismissed by medical staff. You know, see story after story, particularly with COVID, you know, pop up about, you know, even Black women who are, you know, medical staff being denied care by their colleagues because, you know, we as a society cannot trust, you know, folks in marginalized communities to know what is right for them, to know their own bodies, to be able to express what they're experiencing, and to really just have the autonomy and authority over their own care and what that looks like. And even looking at like research studies, we can see that most or many, you know, are of exclusively white sample populations. You know, particularly with medications, for example, we'll see variations in how effective certain medications are for different types of bodies, for different backgrounds and things like that. But the studies are done exclusively on one type of person, and thus rendering the medication ineffective for anybody outside of that population, right? And we can see it in things like mental health as well for the DSM, which is a diagnostic guide for clinicians, the designation for sexuality and gender being placed as a disorder. So we know things that like, being a transgender person is pathologized. Like there's a history of sexuality being pathologized, being treated as something that is in need of curing, of fixing, for example. And so, between the last two editions of the DSM, for example, DSM-4 to DSM-5, there was an update for trans folks of gender dysphoria being listed as the official diagnosis, and that gender affirming care is the approach that you are to treat said disorder, right? But that ultimately places a lot of hoops to jump through in terms of accessing gender affirming care, because now you need an official diagnosis, you need background letters, you need mental health letters in order to get care and control of your own body, and have that actual service provided to you that you pay for, because healthcare is not free. And then, the idea of the service providers not often reflecting the population that they serve, and perhaps not making it a priority to learn more about the populations that they're serving that are different than their own. For my own personal experiences going into the doctor's office, I am frequently told every time I get a new physician, my trans patients usually know more about trans care than I do. So as like a sort of disclaimer, and that doesn't make a person feel super safe, to trust folks with their care.
Wow.
In terms of like, I have to now know all of these medical terms and specific things that is your whole job, your whole profession, right? So, we can see all of those things show through. And so that leads to folks seeking care less frequently. It involves lots of, anxiety prior to going into these appointments, and has ultimately been fatal for like numerous, populations, right? So it's beyond the thought of, I see a note from Laura, mental health care can also be really expensive. Yeah, and that is accurate. So the way that our healthcare system is set up then means that, nonprofits who work on like a sliding scale or provide free services often are overwhelmed with the number of clients that they receive, and they're unable to provide the same level of care and support, for mental health. And so while, folks with marginalized identities and have overlapping identities, for example, in terms of, being, a Black trans woman, the most vulnerable population of people, and experience the highest levels of violence, and things like that, and whether that be through systems or for interpersonal relationships, and that impacts the way that we, even have these discussions, and whose shoulders we're standing on to work our way up. So to consider all of those pieces. And we can see examples of, these systemic isms and phobias and microaggressions. So things that perhaps we've heard ourselves, perhaps things that we have thought ourselves, because we are all raised in the same sort of, with the same sort of like culture, or the same sort of like idea of what it means, to be an individual living in the US, and we're socialized in similar sorts of ways. And so there are some examples of, you're so articulate, or I don't see color, or I don't care if you're black, white, purple, polka dotted. So we just start getting into so we just, having that colorblind mentality doesn't really do us any favors, and it, in fact, is the antithesis of intersectionality. There's the no, like, where are you really from? Or you're really pretty, you're handsome for a, insert identity.
Flashbacks with all of these. Just yeah. Oh God.
There's the, you don't look trans, I couldn't even tell, or you don't look like a queer person, like I couldn't even tell. Or you're so inspiring for overcoming your disability, or, well, your name's like hard to pronounce, so I'll call you blank so-and-so instead, right? And these are all ways in which we, minimize others' identity. And while, it's labeled as like a microaggression, ultimately these all add up and, are a weight to carry. And, as I was just saying, it's like flashbacks, just hearing some of these like sentences or seeing, these written out of how many times in our lives have we been told these kinds of things. And what does that do even to like our subconscious ability to retain new information if it's something that we're hearing in like an educational space, or our level of safety or the type of stress that we're feeling in a particular moment. Being aware. And I want to look at the sort of larger impact of what all this means and what that brings us to. So we can see the impact in, for example, employers being more likely to, call white applicants from less selective universities than they are black applicants from prestigious ones. We can see discrimination regularly occurring through, policing names. And employers are more likely to express interest in a white applicant with a criminal record than they are with a black applicant with no record. And that's a whole other conversation, to deep dive into another day, about what it means to have a criminal record and things like that. But, that sort of highlights the, disparities between different, groups of people and the impact of that. And that all builds from, sense of historical trauma, particularly for Black folks, starting from slavery, exploitation of labor, lynching, lack of care in a pandemic, and any natural disaster, any healthcare services, anything like that. And those like instances of trauma impact and alter our DNA, and then that is then passed down generation to generation. And we can see, an increase of mental health concerns, of health risks in terms of having like higher blood pressure from anxiety and stress that you're then, just adding into the lived experience of being a person of color, for example. And so these are all things that, we have sort of a shared responsibility to do better. And that starts with learning history, listening to the voices of marginalized communities, and, examining our own power and privilege and how we can use that. So some criticisms of looking at intersectionality, for example, some criticisms of intersectionality, as some folks have sort of labeled that as being more of like a buzzword that, is devalued because we're actually looking at the reality of how our society treats different people. But we know that intersectionality rather just provides us a lens with which to better understand ourselves. And it's not necessarily just to think about the ways in which we experience discrimination, but rather to also consider the ways we experience privilege and how we can best use that privilege. And I'm wondering if folks have any sort of thoughts on that.
Always have thoughts. But before I share thoughts, does anyone else want to have some thoughts? Open discussion, brave space, safe space. It's, yeah. Well, I'm just going to say, like, the historical trauma piece, and even just like this component of like privilege and intersectionality and how it all relates to just like the way what we bring to the world and like how we just try to move forward from history. Even as someone who is, you know, queer POC, like I just had this, like my whole life was just like, oh yeah, well, you know, I'm just a person. Like I was that kid that was like, I don't see color while being a person of color, because I was like, I don't know. But then you start seeing some certain patterns and behavior and you're like, is it me? Did I wear something funny today? But then it's like all the time and you're like, huh. And looking back, even looking back at the roots, it's something that, you know, as a 26-year-old person, it's like now is when I'm really starting to dive deeper into historical trauma to really get a better sense of like how I walk on this earth. I don't know, it's like, it takes time, but I think that the little bits and pieces that come into play for me practically are making sure that I enter like the best I could, like what I could be doing like little by little is like entering an interpersonal space with like, with space, like coming in with space to be able to receive someone and receive various facets of their identity. Because sometimes I'll just make assumptions. Sometimes I'll screw up, you know, it happens to everybody. Sometimes I'll forget I'm privileged in my education. Sometimes I'll forget I'm privileged in like, you know, that I don't know, I have a cat. I don't know, you know, and.
Right, because privilege is, you know, definitely one of those things that you don't necessarily recognize that you have it until you are a part of the larger, you know, sort of society, and until it's taken away, perhaps, like those types of things. Like people don't necessarily learn, and for example, in, you know, their like K through 12 education, you know, really any of these things, right? Like I feel like I had to spend all of my undergrad deconstructing everything that I took in from like K through 12 education, right? So, you know, thinking about the kinds of privileges that then are afforded to folks that can afford higher education, that can gain access into these spaces to attend a conference like this, right? Where we can take in this type of information and think about how it applies to our life and maybe reflect on that as a privilege in and of itself, the fact that this is a discourse to be talked about, to be had.
Yes. Super random reference. There's a moment in Pride and Prejudice. I saw a movie in the last 3 months that blew my mind. Where have I been? There's this moment where, you know, one of the main character's friends, she's gonna go off and marry the cousin of her friend, who's a total lame-o, and the main character's like, why would you do this? Like, why? And then the person turns back, she's like, well, I don't have the privilege of affording romance because he's stable. And I'm like, oh, what a moment! You know, I paused it and I screamed because I need to emotionally decompress, right? I'm like a pot, you know? So that's exactly that. Like my parents, no way they're having this kind of conversation. I mean, I tried to write a thing to my dad about that, and he was like, what? The inner who? You know, because he's just like, oh, I gotta go to work. I'm like, Dad, what do you like to do? Oh, you know, so it's like, it's definitely also a generational thing, and especially based on historical trauma and where you come from. Like, we have a privilege right now to be in this room to even have this conversation because we already have a roof over our heads. You know, it's yeah. So it's like I feel I hold a responsibility to get my act together because of that.
So I had an interview with Cal State Fullerton for my doctorate application, and the question that they ask you is, how have your privileges and your marginalization in your life shaped who you are today? And I was so shocked that they were asking me this that I was like, can you repeat that question? But it felt like really good to think about, like, what privileges am I afforded and how am I marginalized in spaces? And there are a lot of privileges that I have, being like a science teacher and being able to educate people. I love the space that, like, I had that conversation with the kid. Like, you don't get to say you don't see color. because what that does, it takes away from the beautiful like culture and history that everyone has, and being able to talk to them about what like intersectionality actually is and how exciting it is. And when you're talking about all those microaggressions, how I'm someone who is like has the privilege of influencing a bunch of young kids, like, no, we're gonna get their name right, even if it's 8 syllables. Like, you don't. And having those conversations with even teachers I've had, like, I need you to spend the time repeating that kid's name until you get it correct, because it's important to them and it's important to me. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That is like a good, definitely a good point. And I mean, we can see that, play out in the fact that, at least in the schools that like I attended, in the public schools in my area, the teaching staff did not reflect the population. It was mostly made up of white folks. And so any name that did not fall under like a seemingly white category or an easy to pronounce by a particular like white, group of folks, is seen as extra work, is seen as being like too difficult, too much time, and that just continues pushing this message that folks with differences like don't deserve our time for some reason, don't deserve like equal respect. And there's something to be said about the idea that we, as a culture, largely say like things like, well, we're all human, we're all just trying to get by, like we should love one another because of our things that make us similar and not focus on the things that make us different, and that sort of assimilationist like mindset. But really, to move a step further would be to recognize like all of those differences, to recognize the beauty of different cultures and the personal like histories of individuals, and saying like, we are different in lots of different ways. We're different in a variety of ways. And let me, recognize that, let me honor and respect that, and try to learn from that as well, rather than immediately pushing that to, the back.
I actually have like a quick question, because I know me and Elliot have had conversations kind of around this. How do you, I guess, like suggest that people almost deal with their white guilt that's like not white guilt? Like, so for example, like you kind of mentioned this like before. Elliot knows exactly what I'm about to do. You said that you're afforded like the privilege of almost being viewed as white, even though like you're not. And like, so it's like, for example, like I'm Hispanic and like I very much look like a white person. My name is Maggie Fox. Like there is nothing like, and my parents like purposely named me that way because like I grew up in New York City in like a neighborhood where like if you were Hispanic and like had an Hispanic name, people like kind of treated you different. So they like tried to like avoid naming their kids people. Yeah, it is called white passing. And I know like I'm a white passing person of color, but like, I guess like, how do you deal with like being almost like marginalized in some spaces, but not in others? Like having that, like, I guess, what is it, like situational privilege, or is it relative privilege? I'm not sure which one's the right thing. Like, how do you deal with that, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is like a really good point. So first I want to say that, yeah, white passing, I guess, is the language that we're familiar with. And I encourage folks to maybe think about language like, white assumed, or straight, like if somebody's straight passing, for example, they're straight assumes, like we as like a society are putting that identity on somebody. It's not necessarily that the goal is to pass as a white person, right? That's sort of like the implication of like white passing, but rather that identity has been assumed of you. And so what does that mean and how you occupy that space? And I think like the thing that you bring up, Maggie, I mean, my last name is Buffington. Like I'm a Latinx person, right? Like, and I think that that's like something that comes from like being, being a biracial person. Like that's a unique space to exist in, right? And we can sort of see where like the social constructs around like race sort of begin to, blur, right? Because definitely depending on like the spaces I'm in, like if I'm in a particularly white area, like I don't have that same like assumed privilege, right? But the fact in which that like I wasn't raised speaking Spanish, and I wasn't like, I was raised with very much of like an assimilationist like mindset of like, no, for all intents and purposes, like you're white, like, and taking that culture from me, is a whole like identity category in and of itself, right? And so, there is that sort of like feeling of like, well, you're not this enough, and you're not enough of this, so where do you belong? And I think like it's just a lot of, therapy for me personally. But it's just that sort of like, I know who I am, and what others like assume of me shows like their sort of like bias in the ways in which like they're operating. And I guess to address the sort of like idea of, having that like white guilt, for example, folks can feel touchy around like the idea of being told that they do have privileges, or they do have privilege, because there's this sort of like idea that it's tied to, so thus you did not earn that, like thus you are undeserving. But really what we're like looking at with privileges is just the fact that it is not because of that facet of your identity that you didn't get something. So if you're like a white person, and you're recognized as a white person, you can be certain that somebody treating you a particular way, or you not getting the job, or you not getting into the grad program, isn't because of your race, just rather because of the requirements of whatever situation. So it's more so, I think, like that sort of panic from folks who, feel uncomfortable talking about race, who feel like uncomfortable like unpacking their identity, because we don't have the super accessible language to do that, and like as like a larger culture. And so we sort of have a tendency to try to like villainize or like demonize these kinds of ideas of like owning privilege and owning the space that you hold. It's more of like a looking at equity rather than, the idea of like equality. So the fact that like we're, I don't know, some folks like will say things like, oh, well, you're getting special treatment because you're of this particular like race category, or because there's a quota, or because there's this. And that, simply isn't true. The fact is that like these, opportunities just wouldn't even be afforded at all to lots of different marginalized groups. So we're just looking at like larger space. Hi, Ellie. I saw your hand raised.
Yes. No, just no. Okay. Sorry. I have a question. So, like, so much of this is how we interact with others. It's like it's how we function or dysfunction. And I'm wondering, kind of looking big picture, taking a step back, when we're having these conversations about the impact, when we're having the conversation about intersectionality and like our own identity and what we bring to the table, like how do you see like, we have these intersections as being a woman or a cis woman, whether it's, white assumed, it's like the intersection between women and STEM and those individuals. This is a space where it's like, it's pretty fascinating to like be around so many like white male professors that have no idea what this is about. I'm actually still pretty shocked that, I'm still trying to figure that out for the future. But like, I wonder like I wonder how we can be functioning on a micro level, on a relation to interrelation level, to make this more of a functional space related to welcoming intersection and empowering intersection. Because I'm still trying to figure that out, you know.
Mhm.
Currently chairing, you know, graduate women in computer science, and that's something that I'm still trying to figure out.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think like largely it, you know, it was built upon having like a sense of cultural humility, and just a general sort of um, I don't know, acceptance that we can't know everything as people, and things are, you know, like language is changing and evolving, like our understanding of different identities, and social justice movements and things like that are, you know, constantly, um, you know, evolving to better suit the population that it's meant to serve, right? So I think like a lot of that, a lot of what we're talking about, um, you know, comes down to being open to receiving new information, be open to, you know, identities that maybe you're not familiar with or feel that sort of discomfort with, because, you know, a lot of it comes from fear. A lot of, you know, a lot of the issue is that like folks don't want to do that self-examination because they're afraid of, you know, seeming uneducated, of seeming like uncaring because they don't know, of being labeled, you know, bigot because they don't necessarily know what they don't know, right? And so all being like locked in fear then just means that we're further, you know, demonizing, and villainizing folks that are different from ourselves, because, you know, we would rather keep folks in a box and keep them away as long as that doesn't, you know, mess with our own egos, essentially. And I see that particularly in somebody that like I, you know, work with a school district, right, and, you know, provide similar types of trainings to educators, right? And it's tricky because it's like, well, we as educators don't want to seem like we don't know, because we're supposed to be the ones that are providing information. We're the ones that are creating these spaces. What do you mean there's like further learning that I should be doing? You know, so it's just like there is a lot of vulnerability that comes with examining those things.
So it's almost like we need to make a better effort to like create more vulnerable space to even have those conversations like in practice. Which a lot of the stuff is very like, for me, it's like, how do I? It's a lot of like energy. I mean, call me whatever, but like really setting up the space to be able to even have sense that, because it's like these are intimate conversations. I mean, like a lot of us don't know each other, but we're happening, you know, because we set up the space. So it's like, I guess having more of these kinds of rooms, these kinds of setups, and setting people up to be like, I'm going to have this conversation. It might be uncomfortable, but I can withstand this conversation because I know that I'm safe, because I know that I'm seen. But having that foundation is crucial. Yeah.
Yeah, and like as you know, individuals, like thinking about how inclusive is my language, like what assumptions like come through, or like what biases like really show through in ways that I maybe didn't recognize, things like that. Like, you know, for example, like we are so accustomed to using like super gendered language, and you know, assign particular gender identities on folks based off of our own bias, based off of what is easy for us because it's what the categorizing that we are familiar with and, you know, have been, you know, taught from the time we were born, right? So I think like there is something to be said about being sure that you're being thoughtful of one of like the space that you're occupying and your own vulnerabilities, but being thoughtful of the types of, you know, language, like the type of language that you use to, you know, talk to other folks and to connect with folks. Because, you know, if the thing with like learning something new is that you do have to be open, right? And if you want somebody to be open and to learn more about you, you know, to like minimize or to detract like a core piece of who they are and their identity with like a gendered assumption, for example, will make that person physically incapable of like taking in new information for a period of time and retaining their brain, like retaining that type of education because of the trauma response, right? So, you know, there's something to be said about having, like I said, like this sort of safe space, you know, a space where we can assume best intent, where we can assume like the ways that people are speaking about identity and everything is with care rather than with malice, and that isn't always the case, right? So it's like seeking out these spaces and modeling that kind of behavior in the groups that you know, largely exist in.
Yeah. Just jumping in here because we have a couple minutes left. We have some questions. We have one question coming in that was, speaking on early education, how would you recommend bringing this into the conversation with younger people? / would you / how early?
That's a good question. I encourage it from jump, essentially. You know, I mean, I think like speaking about identity and who we are is largely through you know, representation. Is through like the sort of, you know, media that we consume, and you know, if you're like a teacher, for example, the type of like material and examples that you use to you know, create a curriculum do have like an impact. So I think like being aware of that representation and how diverse is, I don't know, for like young kids, for example, like how diverse are the characters in their stories? Are all of the picture books that a child is looking at of one race in particular, you know, what kind of toys are being purchased, and what those types of things look like, what music that you listen to, and what kind of literature you value, all of those types of things, you know, play a part into our understanding of other folks and our openness to learn about different, you know, identities. And so, I mean, my thought is that, you know, building that foundation from the very beginning makes those conversations less scary, because it's not something that we just don't talk about. It's not something labeled as like, well, be too impolite, or this isn't like polite conversation, and we don't acknowledge it. It just makes it scarier than it is.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Any last minute burning question before we close out? You can speak, hop on audio, don't Q&A, put in the chat.
I mean, I'll just say, I think that this was great, and it honestly like made me think about like how I see myself a lot, which is not something I feel like I typically, at least like consciously do. So like to have to like sit there and like really like boil things down and like pick those like 3 things in the beginning. Like I said before, I was like, I had such a hard time picking 3 things to get rid of something. I was like, I don't know. I was like, I couldn't even pick them, and now you want me to get rid of something? It was just wasn't
Yeah,
it just like wasn't something that like I really ever like thought about. So I really appreciated everything that you walked us through, and I personally I found this very helpful.
Thank you. I appreciate the praise. So if anybody else wants to, you know, shower me with compliments, you're welcome to now.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Like literally, I thought this was a great conversation, and being able to hold space for honesty is great, like, and empowering. And Sarah says, showers of compliments. Yes, amazing. Feel free to, we're going to be having these kinds of conversations each day. You know, we had one today, we'll have another one tomorrow, which I will be leading. We'll also have another one on Saturday for younger noobs. So stick around. We're going to have next is the fireside chats, right? That's going to be on the main stage, and we're excited to see you there. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Maggie, for your help.
Thank you for having me.